Hello, everybody. Hello, dear friends. Here is Alex. You also know me as PTSD86. And this is E-Radio. And there is my dear friend, Jeffrey Rosenthal.
Howdy.
And today we have a really interesting panel. Today we have really outstanding uh, people here, very profound people here, Ukrainians both, and both writers, contemporary writers, Ostap Ukrainets and Evgen Lir. And we are talking today about Ukraine, about this war which burns our land, about differences of optics as we normally do on iRadio. I mean, I imply optics of the West and East. And Jeffrey, if you please elaborate on what we are going to do today. Again, you don't have
Is
sound.
your market off?
Again, we have two fantastic guests here today from Ukraine, ready to tell us their perspectives as creators, as artists, as Ukrainians about what is happening on the ground today in Ukraine. So really, without any further ado, Eugene, shall we start with you? If you'd like to just give a brief introduction to yourself, just a little background, just as,
Sure
maybe
thing.
introduction.
So, it's nice to be able to talk to you. And unfortunately, for some safety reasons, there is no way I can join you by video. So just enjoy seeing the cat playing piano. My name is Yevhen Weir. I'm from Melitopol, Ukraine. I'm 26 right now, and we have been working together with Ostap for last maybe 3 years. Uh, and we have our YouTube channel called Guerrilla Humanitarium, where we try to elaborate on some topics about Ukrainian mythology, Ukrainian linguistics, about Ukrainian culture, our identity, and so on. Also, we have a publishing house, so-called Guerrilla Humanitarium as well, and it was going to be such a huge year for us because we were getting ready to publish at least 4 new books. We were getting ready for one of the biggest festivals of book fashion, if we can call it this way, in Ukraine. But unfortunately, Russians came once again for our land, and right now we both are working in real underground, trying to save as much lives, trying to help as many soldiers as we are able to.
Thank you, Eugene.
Please.
Ostap.
Stop, please.
My name is Ostap. My last name literally means Ukrainian, so it's a nice hit. I'm 27. I am same as Eugene. I'm a writer and a translator. We work together with my wife, who unfortunately is not joining us today. But yeah, basically everything that Eugene said was and is true. The difference is that I can still show my face because I'm from western part of Ukraine, where no Russians are nowadays, and I doubt they ever will be. But for me, it's far easier, and I cannot imagine how it works out for Eugene right now. But yeah, that's kind of what we do. We switched off, and my last months passed not translating and writing my own stuff, but sorting out medication and searching for some thermal visors and tourniquets and whatever. But well, I hope that we will be able to catch up at least something in the next months to try and combine our work as volunteers helping the army and as writers, translators, and publishers trying to work on Ukrainian culture because it needs to be worked on. The life, well, it may sound cynical to say that life goes on, but I believe that we should not leave it be and make it look like no cultural impact matters nowadays. So I am personally trying to get back into that and trying to work part-time on both.
Yeah, and if I may add, there is an interesting hint Ostap just mentioned that Putin states that one of the main purposes of waging the war and genocide of Ukrainians is so-called demilitarization. You may have heard it different ways, different maybe contexts, but you definitely heard it about it. And the thing is that the whole Ukrainian society is now much more militarized as if we even try to view in consideration with January this year or the whole past year, because now nearly every Ukrainian knows the difference between, say, DJI Mavic Air 2S and DJI Mavic 3. We all know how to choose tourniquets. We all know what is tactical medicine. We know the difference between the armor. And this is the knowledge you never knew you needed, and you hope you would never need actually. But hard times make us all dive into some other world, maybe we never knew we should be into.
Yeah, confirm. As Ukrainian, transformation of society is immense and really quick. But also, gentlemen, agree that a little bit of Cossacks always was here in us. Oh, right. As heirs of Sarmats, um, that is in our blood. So we have tried to structurize our talk, and we put down some bullet points. So if you don't
That
mind,
raises an interesting point, Alex, just sort of about the vernacular. From demilitarization to denazification to de-Ukrainization. What does that tell us about the evolution of Russian motivations in this war, and how does that, what does that actually reflect in terms of Ukrainian character? Why do we see this evolution from the beginning of the war to the Real Novosti article, recently on de-Ukrainization? I think that slips rather cleanly into the first point.
If I may start trying to answer that question, because I've been giving it quite a thought recently, and I believe these three terms are all the same, just used regarding different aspects of the same Russian politics. So demilitarization is a kind of a first step. It's and they're trying to make us not defend ourselves, because, well, if you don't have military, you can do nothing against the invasion. That was their sweet dream. That was their expectations. That were their expectations. After all, they expected to conquer Ukraine really quick. They expected army to crumble. So that was the idea of demilitarization when we have no organized defense. The next step is, of course, denazification, which is, well, we all know what that means because they already did it time and again in the 20th century. It's just plain repressions against all those who can speak up, who can do something about it. It's a repression against teachers, against writers, of course, against composers, all those who are creating and keeping a culture and thus cultural identity of Ukraine. And the third step, the Ukrainization, which they spoke of a month into the invasion. I wonder why the article even came out, because it looked more like they were preparing it for their plan A scenario when they capture Ukraine in some 3 days or 2 weeks or whatever. And then, well, the Ukrainization is just plain assimilation. When you destroy enough people who won't be who won't believe they are not Ukrainians, who won't believe they are not Russians. Far more people than you might think will just accept their small Russian so-called identity as given, because, well, that's what makes them safe after all. And I'm not sure even that I can judge such a behavior given the circumstances, because that happened more than once already. So I believe it was like a three-step or three-part plan to integrate Ukraine into this broader Russian context, which is not one Russian nation, but a patchwork of hundreds of different nations, not even Slavic mostly, but all brought together by this idea of a grand fascist state, which is feared in Europe. And when you are feared, only then you are worth of respect. That is kind of their national idea, and these three parts, demilitarization, denazification, and de-Ukrainization, are perfectly in accord with this political idea.
I have a small thing to add here. You know, all lawyers are a bit nasty, and I am a lawyer. So when we say that there are many nations in Russian Federation, well, Russian Federation, right? We rather imply that there are many peoples, but there are no nations, right? Nation is a aggregation of citizens, right? And also, if please, because you inspired me to give a comment here, Ostap. When you made this 3-8, right? Triada, I don't know, 3-8, right? Totally agree on that. Also, but I've been thinking of that too, and I think it is like recently that I got it after they started this so-called second stage. Many efforts the empire invested into suing and putting on itself a black tie West-like suit, right? Denazification, denationalization, neutrality of Ukraine. All of these are Western civilized categories. And as much as we know Russia, it always fought wars with no regard to any civilizational or legal rules. So I think also this 3-8, right, the way it sounded, because you actually, Ostap, you gave the true meaning behind it, what they meant, right? But the way they presented it, it was done to gain some time, to make the West hesitate, to make the West look at this situation with distorted optics that it has. Because this is, of course, how I see it, because there is difference between Europe and Asia. And Russia represents more Asia in my mind. Sorry, microphone goes to you. Sorry.
Well, that's interesting because I think, 25 years ago, Brzezinski said, without Ukraine, Russia is confined to being a Eurasian empire. And that was with a much weaker Turkey and China. But frankly, yeah, I mean, that's sort of, Ostap, just on your last point, I think there's an interesting balance in Russia between like, what do they actually believe and what is just sort of put out for propaganda for public consumption. I mean, do you think in any world they realistically, like the top brass, actual military intelligence, people making operational decisions, did they really believe Ukraine could be conquered in 48 hours? Like, was that, yeah, and just sort of to continue on from there, like, and who is Russia? Who is Ruski?
I'm not sure if their military were sure that they will conquer Ukraine in 48 hours, or no matter how many hours. Well, if you saw that, I'm not sure what was that press conference or whatever, where Putin recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, all that in brackets, of course. Naryshkin, their head of intelligence, was kind of nervous about that. I believe that he was not sure they are able to do that in military terms. But then it's not about waging your conventional war. I don't believe they were preparing for one. They were preparing for your typical salami revolution they always did when it was about a country big enough and populated enough to defend itself. Remember that Ukraine has a population, this 1/3 of total Russian population, and we are fighting on our soil. I'm sorry. So it was not about crushing the military in a conventional combat. It was about crushing the state, because the concept of failed state regarding Ukraine was pivotal for Russian propaganda for years. It was the way they talked about Ukraine all the time. They did not make it go outside that much, of course, but that was their propaganda for internal consumption, and that's what most Russians believed in. I know that because I talked to them. I've been to Russia some uh, 10, 12 years ago, and even then, lots of them were convinced that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that Ukrainians live in a failed state. And it was, I believe, 2012 when I was in Moscow and I decided to watch their news, and there was a news report from Ukraine. I'm not sure if it was indeed shot in Ukraine, but there was some guy talking about Ukrainians being poorest nation in Europe, eating hedgehogs because they are the sole source of meat. I'm not making that up. That's what actually was on their state TV. But 2 points here. First of all, it doesn't matter if people actually believe every word they say. But it is enough for people to think, well, maybe there is at least something to it. They cannot make this entire thing up. There should be at least something to it, because any rational person tries to believe that everyone else is at least the slightest bit rational. Well, that's not the case here. And they are, of course, doing it on purpose. I'm convinced that their propagandists are they are aware that they are spreading lies, or at least not telling the truth in general, even if they believe that Ukraine is poorest nation in Europe indeed. But after what we saw near Kiev, after all the marauding some stuff that cost like several cents, but they took it anyways because it's kind of a souvenir. Well, it brings me to my second point, that favorite tool of Russian propaganda is blaming everyone around them for what they are guilty of themselves. So they spent years talking about Nazis in Ukraine, and we see literal fascist behavior on state and personal level both nowadays. They spoke of Ukrainians being the poorest nation in Europe, and they ended up stealing water closets from people's houses because they don't have any. And that's kind of what they do, I believe. Russian, to my mind, Ruski, as you put it, is not a national identification, because I've met some Tatars who were calling themselves Ruskis. I met people of different language and ethnic groups who believe they are Ruskis. So it's a kind of belonging to this group, and the group is united by sheer power. It's a military might. It's a strength. It's idea of strength and idea of being able to threaten anyone who doesn't agree. And then, of course, there is a huge historical resentment to it. So that's why Ukrainians and Belarusians are the ones to suffer now. That's why Chechens were the ones to suffer in the 90s, and Georgians in 2008. because all these territories are regarded as a part of historical space. Germans have a really nice word for it. It is Lebensraum. I believe you know where it comes from. So yeah, that's historical space that they feel belongs to them. Everybody living in that historical space must this way belong to the greater Russian nation. And everybody who does not, and that's literally what they are saying now in their propaganda, is just the same Ruski, but uh, he was just misled. He just believes it the wrong way. He was convinced for some reason by some big bad NATO authorities that he is not Ruski anymore, and that's what Ukrainian national and cultural identity is for them. Ukrainian is just a kind of uh, wicked Russian, a Russian who does not believe he is Russian anymore, and that should be changed. That behavior should be changed, and if it cannot be changed, if he cannot be de-Ukrainianized, then he's a Nazi, and thus he must be denazified, eliminated. They mean.
Eugene, we not only don't see you, but we don't hear you. Could you please also comment here? I'm sure you have to say here a lot.
Sure, I just want to elaborate on some points made by Ostap because, first of all, I'm a great fan of both Peter Watts and first season of True Detective, and they come together in this point of view because we are living in a time being a square circle, excuse me, and we are actually witnessing. Uh, I think the terminal state of Russian narratives that all come together. First of all, if we think about the demilitarization, yeah, and doing, but by the way, doing it for some greater good. It's the narrative Russia has been following since day one, I think, because if we come back in time to 1709, when Zaporizhzhia siege was destroyed, actually the last Ukrainian independent state for like 300 years-ish until the Ukrainian Republic rose. It was destroyed for the reasons of demilitarizing the dangerous, not Nazis, they haven't got the idea of nationalism back then, but destroying some, brigades, maybe, so some people who they just didn't want to see in their territory. And it was done under the idea of protecting their land from Poland and from Ottoman Empire they have already defeated in Crimea. The same thing happened when they were fighting Ukrainians at the start of 20th century, when Ukrainian Republic rose, and once again, it was not the war with Ukrainians, it was war with the Western world trying to push their limits into Ukrainian territory. It was the war with capitalism, it was the war with narratives that were trying to maybe capture the Russian idea, and they really believe in such thing as Russian world. By the way, it's a common misconception calling it Russian peace. There is no such a thing as Russian peace because, as we can see, everywhere Russia steps its foot, it brings only war, no peace at all. And I'm actually grateful that Ostap mentioned Chechens, Ostap mentioned Georgians, because the only war Russia, I mean, after the destruction, let me call it this way, after the destruction of Soviet Union, the only war Russia actually lost was the First Ichkerian War. And it was really, really common for Russians just to invade small republics, I mean, former Soviet republics, just to make them join Russia once again, just because they didn't want them to become independent state. And this brings us to the situation where Russia is actually maybe one of the last, is not the last, colonizer state in the world. While the whole world moves on, Russia just stays in mid, maybe 19th century. I'm not even sure if we can call it 20th, because the colonizer discourse actually died in 20th century. But nevertheless, Chechen War or Ichkerian War was lost by Russia, even though Ichkeria is just a small piece of land with population maybe 2 or 3 million people, if I'm not mistaken. And it was lost for the reason I hope they will lose to Ukrainians as well. And the reason is fighting spirit. The reason is every single person in the land being ready to defend it. Every single person not wanting to be once again absorbed by this great idea of pan-Slavism. It's not even the idea of being Ruskies. It's a funny thing they call pan-Slavism. And it's just funny because if we take Russia as a federation, Slavic population will be maybe 30%, maybe 35, not more than that, because we have Tatars, we have Bashkirians, and a lot of other people, other folks. And Chechens, Ichkerians, they are, first of all, they are Muslim state. They have their own cultural identity. And as we all know, they have elected their own president. They have elected Johar Dudayev, who was their leader and is still a symbol of freedom, still a symbol of general successfully pushing back Russians. And the thing we are witnessing right now in Mariupol, the thing we are going to witness in Donbas region, as the moment we are speaking right now, I mean, Russians are trying to make a rather straightforward attack on several cities in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Of course, our military forces are ready. Of course, they are fighting back, but we're living through very, very tough days. And the same thing they did to Mariupol, they're doing to Mariupol, they did to the city of Grozny. It was nearly devastated. You can watch photos and you can see that the city was actually the ghost of its former self. You can also remember several examples of denazification Chechens, which actually means destroying, killing, and trying to hide any signs of their own doings in several Chechen villages. Russians, they don't care about whether you are a child, whether you are a woman, whether you are a man, how old are you, what are you doing. This everything does not matter because they come to make you fear. This war, it's not about gaining respect. It's not about gaining any political points because, well, you see, Russia has every sanction possible laid on it. Well, nearly any. I'm watching some European countries and their readiness to pay for Russian gas in rubles. Bollocks, actually, it makes me a little bit mad and crazy, but that's the other thing, yeah? We will talk about it, I think, in some time. But my point is that right now Russia is trying to put Ukraine in the whole state of terror and fear, and they are not trying to win the war by the military cause, because you see, they wanted to capture Kharkiv, that is just some 30, 40 kilometers from the Russian border. They failed. They actually put all they could on the attack to Kiev. Once again, same here. They have never captured any region of any part of Kiev. So right now, it's just about laying terror, and they want us, they want Ukrainians to be in such state of mind, in such psychological state, that we would beg for some kind of peace, that we would be ready to sacrifice our land, to sacrifice our freedom, to sacrifice our being Ukrainians, just for this hell, for this bloody hell on earth to stop. And fortunately enough, we have adequate enough president and military government to not fail into this trap, and Ukrainians will keep resisting. We shall stand our ground.
If I may add one thing, because Eugene was talking about war, and I want to add about wording problem here, because we are framing it all as war, and we are right to do that, sure. Entire world is framing this as war because it is one, but then Russia does not. It's a special military operation for a reason, because as a colonial empire, Russia cannot allow itself to fight a war. A war must be just. It's a war of defense. That's why a Second World War, which they call Great Patriotic War, is a war. Afghan war in Afghanistan in the 80s was framed still as war because, well, it was in their propaganda a just cause, like helping legitimate government that they installed. But then, if you are going to fight a nation that you do not recognize as one, you cannot call that a war. You are not fighting regular military. You are fighting Nazis, or as it was 100 years ago with Ukrainian Republic back then, you are fighting bandits or brigands. And if we are talking Kazakh state that Eugene mentioned, it was once again not fighting an army. It was fighting bandits, and it's bandits all along. Whenever you want to justify your war, A, you don't call it a war, you call it whatever you want, but not a war. And B, you don't call the military the military, you call them bandits, or because we have that Nazi bait after Second World War, and the Nazis just a swear word you coin all around the place wherever you want to someone to look bad, and you fight Nazis, of course. And if that makes you recognize 44 million people as Nazis, entire population as Nazis, well, then you do that because you don't even care if other people believe you. You just make something to justify it. It doesn't matter if someone believes. That's what they did in the Soviet Union. Like in KGB, when they were interrogating someone, it didn't matter if a person actually did something. Everyone involved might have known that person was innocent, but well, then the person should be convicted. No matter how ridiculous, you make this person sign an agreement recognizing herself as guilty. You make it look at least the slightest bit legal, so that you can then take a stance and say, well, but he signed it. Well, but they are Nazis. It's not that obvious as you may think. There is more than one point to it, and well, that's everything you need to cause political chaos. That's the gist of their politics.
Thank you, Ostap.
Oh, one quick point, Alex. Just that, for context, Putin's reign began with the Second Chechen War and the bombing, in the mass destruction of Grozny. So, that's how this began. Please, Alex.
It also started with Buynaksk Shuga, if we speak of that, and he already we already heard it from of their media, of Russian media, that Ukrainians are preparing terror attacks in Kursk and Belgorod regions, and they are going inside there. They are digging trenches. They are bombing their own oil. How you call it? Gas installments. How you
reserves.
Call it? Yeah. But I really needed to make a tiny footnote to what just Eugene said, because I'm afraid in Western audience not everybody knows what is Chechnya and how actually it won, because you, Eugene, put it right. Chechnya won. Because now Moscow is paying, pouring billions there, right? Like, I mean, all of the Grozny was rebuilt, and this puppet of Kadyrov, right? Kadyrov. So just a little footnote. The war lasted for almost 10 years, right? And it was lost, and you correct me, gentlemen, if I'm wrong, please. But it was lost by Chechnya because one of those clans, and that is a clan society until today, it just betrayed its nation. And that was clan of Kadyrov. They started collaborating, and for that, Moscow made him, how you call it, procurator, or how you say it, uh,
Imperial
go guy.
legates. I don't.
Yeah, like rep. I don't know. Who were
And
those
also,
involved?
look at
Those
who's
who
fighting in Ukraine now. There's
Rome,
the
that are the
Kazarovtsi, and there's the loyal free Chechens who are fighting with Ukrainian forces now.
Chechens even don't like when Kadyrov men are called Chechens. They say no, there are Chechens and there are Kadyrov guys. And
Kazarovtsi.
also, thank you very much, Eugene, for bringing up name of Johar Dudayev. Right, these days, especially in our segment of internet, we have plenty of these documentaries, because he gave several interviews in his bunker where he was hiding from Russian rockets. And by the way, he was assassinated like that by a direct strike of a Russian missile. I just one citation, and I give microphone to you, gentlemen. Johar Dudayev said once, and this was actually a prophecy. He said, the dawn, dusk of Russian Empire will come on the day when sun of Ukraine rises. So today, orcs came to ensure that sun of Ukraine never rises. Microphone goes to you. Thank you.
Yep, and one more point, Jeffrey, I actually want to ask you a question, because prove me wrong if I'm saying something incorrect, but if I'm not mistaken, the United States right now don't even recognize the 9th of May as the day of great victory or something like that. Throughout all the world, we have the 8th of May, yeah, and it's the day of rememberation of all the people who died during the World War II, and there is no warmongering around it. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the many sort of separations, such as like the nomenclature, Second World War versus Great Patriotic War, May 8th versus May 9th, Christmas in December versus January. I joke. But yeah, that's a distinct separation.
Yeah,
And actually,
and it's important,
Eugene,
actually, yeah.
yes. Especially, of course, with Victory Day as the avowed, purported date that Russia wishes to end their invasion, which is sort of a preposterous and terrifying notion.
Yeah, and it's actually the reason why I brought this date up, because Putin himself, maybe, and his propaganda machine for sure, they are trying to make a narrative of so-called parallel history. If you are common with the Russian culture, you know that there is such branch of fantastic books there called alternative history, and it's just weird. Not the way Howard Lovecraft is weird, but the way weird which makes you a little bit uneasy and you cringe, basically. It's the series of books where, for example, Stalin goes back in time to save Napoleon in order to conquer the United States of America. For example, I'm sure the book I have just described exists. And it's the whole genre, and the reality Putin is trying to make his people believe is pretty close to this one. Because, for example, If we take the statistics of World War II, we can see that a lot of Ukrainian soldiers, a lot of Belarusian soldiers died as well. They fought the Third Reich as well. And we all remember the infamous station by Putin that we would have done it without you, speaking to Ukrainians about winning the World War II. And it's important because the point of view is not about the suffering World War II caused. It's not about numerous lives destroyed. Actually, Europe being devastated in its state, and it's not about showing the maybe point where you would never like to return to. No, Russia as a political system is just a great warmonger trying to justify their participation in basically any military operation going in the world. And I'm not speaking about the war against Ukraine. I'm speaking about their participation in Syria. I'm speaking about what they did in Georgia in 2008, and of course in 1990s. And actually, Russians don't see a problem. They don't see a single problem in invading the territory of other country. They see a problem in losing the war. This is why the Afghanistan war is a little bit dramatic for them because they actually lost. And more than that, they lost to the country they viewed as far inferior to them. And the same thing happened in First Chechen War, and the same thing is happening right now with all of those numerous memes with, trucks guiding Russian military. We have just received, like an hour or so, my friends have sent me a photo of a Russian tank T-90 being maybe one of the most fearsome machineries they have ever provided, just burned down in Ukrainian fields, and some villagers trying to take some wood from it. So, right now, Russia is being embarrassed in the thing, in the context, in the narrative they tried to protect for the whole period of their existence. And this is one of the reasons why they are so cruel right now fighting, because they were not ready for it. They were not ready for Ukrainians to make them a joke.
And it's worth pointing out, too, that Russia accumulated the same number of deaths as the Soviet-Afghan war within, I believe, the first 3 weeks of the renewed invasion of Ukraine. 3 weeks to, roughly 15,000 deaths. The number is far higher now, of course, surpassing that entire war in Afghanistan. Now, there's something else you mentioned. I think this sort of ties back in very neatly to the issue of ideology, nomenclature, and like denazification. Because when we're talking about denazification, in this context, what are we talking about? Russia has very clear and independent ideas about what World War II meant and what their geopolitical role as a consequence means. So in a way, they've euphemized Nazism such that Nazism has nothing to, like, it's not a conflict that Nazism is referring to. They're referring to a people who elected a Jewish president as a Nazi state. That has nothing to do with it. And Russians have said as much explicitly. It doesn't matter if they're Jewish. Essentially, anyone who resists Russian imperialism, anyone who resists, let's say, the liberatory imperialism of the Russian state is a Nazi, because the Nazis, the only relevant historical context for Nazism to contemporary Russia is that they were those who resisted Russia's liberation and led to the deaths of, however many, 20 million plus Red Army soldiers. And I think this is really crucial just for this sort of forged ideology and the forged historical narrative of the contemporary Russian Empire.
Sometimes it feels like you are Ukrainian, Dr. Rosenthal, especially in this nice Vyshivanka that I forgot to thank you for.
True.
Gentlemen, we just look at this beauty. Show. Yes, дякую, of course. Yeah, I love it. Where you got it from?
Rivne.
Ah, Rivne, nice, nice. So you are American Banderovets, right? As Russians would put it. What is there next on our list? Sort of
Well,
trying.
actually, I was hoping maybe Ostap could sort of speak to, the ideology of denazification and like what that means, and also perhaps we could kind of get into that Rus versus Ruski, in terms of historical origins. Like, because I think a lot of Western people don't really understand. We hear even Macron talking about, Russia and Ukraine being brother nations. But I would love it if you could just disambiguate that, like, when was Moscow born? How Mongol is it? And what right do they have to the heritage of Rus and the Rurikid dynasty?
Starting with a little comment on denazification and why it went so wrong, it's because that's what happens when you try to make a victory your private business. When you make it look like you are the sole victor, because in Russian narrative, they are not the ones who won the Second World War. They are the only ones who did that. The Allies had nothing to do with that. Ukrainians and Belarusians who suffered the most because our land was occupied totally, unlike Russian land at the time. And so Nazis became their arch enemy. They became their existential threat. And thus, because Russians are the sole victors over Nazism, everyone who says anything against Russia, who gives any opposition, is a Nazi. That's the twisted logic they apply here. And it's important to understand that when we are talking about Nazism and when Russians are talking about Nazism, we mean different things. These words have totally different meanings for any Westerner living west of Russia, literally, and people living east of that border. And now regarding Russia and Rus and why, first of all, why people like Macron can say this totally weird stuff for Ukrainians like us being brothers. Well, lots of Ukrainians did believe we are brotherly nations. It was a propaganda for hundreds of years, and it would be a miracle if no one bought for it. But then once again, it's about the way you use some words and the way you apply meaning to that words, because Rus was not an ethnic state. It was a medieval kingdom. It was a large medieval kingdom consisting of many, well, let's say tribes or clans. Each of that had their chieftains, but then they were all united around Kiev. At some point they became the way almost any medieval state came into being. It was a state that took most of territory of contemporary Ukraine, most of Belarusian territory, and some territory in northwest of Russia nowadays. Then to call one of the Rus, to call one Rus or Rusich or Rusen or Rusnak, we have many words for that, all with the same root. Literally meant the one belonging to that unity. When I say unity, I mean political unity, because it was a kingdom, and then after the Mongols came, bigger part of it, and with all the nobility who decided to unite with Lithuanian with Duchy of Lithuania to oppose the Mongols, then became a part of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then after some political transformations, they became a part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a normal thing in a pre-modern world because territories changed, sovereigns changed, and it was kind of okay because all the legislation was still in old Ukrainian back then. All the documents, including state documents, were in old Ukrainian. It doesn't matter if you call that Duchy of Lithuania or if you call that Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania. There was a huge ethnic part of people who considered themselves of the Rus, and then some provinces were literally called like White Rus, which we now know as Belarus. It's literally White Rus. And then Ukrainian region I am from was known as Red Rus, Червона Rus. And so it was the only logical thing that people living here would associate with their ethnicity and with that small local identity they got used to, because their nobility, people they learned to trust, people they were literally fighting for, because we are talking of times when noblemen brought their subjects to war. There were no conscripts, and that was the common name. But then there was a concept of Rus preserved in that northeastern part that belonged to the Mongol Empire for far longer than any other part, because Rus was conquered by Mongols entirely in 13th century. Then large chunks of it broke apart, like White Rus and Red Rus. They joined with Lithuania. They overthrew Mongol overlords, and they kind of got their independence as a part of a different Christian kingdom, because we're talking pre-modern times. The thing that mattered was that it is a Christian kingdom where their faith and their language is allowed. That was about that. And so the name lasted. And then when the idea of so-called Greater Russia was born much later in the 17th century, of course, they attributed that historical, I'm not sure what's the English for what I want to say here, was they applied this historical lineage, lineage, to themselves. They, of course, being a historical part of the same medieval kingdom, applied the word, but given the imperialist thought, given the imperialist worldview they applied back then, they decided that anyone who call themselves of the Rus is thus a Russian. So when a concept of a nation was born, when a concept of the modern political nation was born, according to their state ideology, anyone who believes he is of the same political lineage, who traces roots to old Kievan kingdom with a center in Kiev, is thus Russian. And so all the Ukraine, because, well, our capital is Ukraine and we regarded it as the most important city of our land, must be Russian. That was the logic. It was still twisted and perverse, but that was the logic of an empire. It was commonplace. It was commonplace in the 17th century. Britain and France were not much better back then, but Britain and France evolved since then. Their view on what is Britain and France has changed. Russian view did not, because for them, still everyone who traces their lineage to Kiev is a Russian. No way around that. If you want to call yourself a Ukrainian, you are a Russian. That's for us, it makes sense as a logical conundrum. For them, it's the only thing that makes sense. If you are a Belarusian, well, then you are Russian. If your ancestors, and well, my great grandfather called himself Rusin because, well, they were Rusins, they were from Red Rus. But from Russian point of view, they were Russian despite the fact they had nothing in common linguistically, tradition-wise. They were Catholics. It all didn't matter. They are Russian because they trace their lineage to that same medieval kingdom, which is absurd, because that's the same if France believed that Germany and everyone calling themselves Germans are French, in fact, because both nations trace their history to Clovis I, which is absurd, but then we see a lot of absurdity these days here.
May I again be a little bit that nasty lawyer, right? Because you've used several times word state, applying it to what was around Kiev, somewhere in between six, let's put it directly, like six maybe, and 12th century, right? 13th century, right?
I mean more like 10 to 12th century after it was consolidated around the single center in Kiev.
Yeah, but being a lawyer, I would rather put it differently. It was an agglomeration, right? And by the way, how ancient Greeks saw it, and they saw, we see it from another cliche, which is already outdated, but Russians love it and they perceive it in a perfect way. They say Kyiv, or as they say, Kiev is the mother of Russian cities, right? And that is actually a reflection of ancient Greek paradigm. They were living in the world of policies, states, and they were calling the biggest polis in an area mother, like metropolis, right? And actually, that was like that, more or less, for Rus. And another thing, being lawyer, if we mention Grand Duchy Lithuanian, we also have to tell to foreign people, because we know it, they don't, that the full name of that already state, right, was Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Rus, and Gemantia. And Rus was the same. But I don't argue on Ostap applying word kingdom at all. Did you notice? Because we had the crown, we got it somewhere between 1253 and 1254, and that was King Danilo, the one who, on the basis of Red Rus, preserved our statehood, if we can put it like that. Because again, we are trying here to discuss history using modern concepts, right? And they're not always applicable. And the last thing here also, but by the way, this difference between modern concepts and historical heritage that we hear is very much abused by Russia. And my favorite example is their own name, Russia, right? Which is, honestly speaking, Greek exonym of Rus, right? Which was to put it flat and straight, stolen by Peter I in 1721.
And remember, of course, what Herodotus said about Russia, cannibals, right? Anthropophagi.
Oh, well, yes.
And if you want to go back to the ancient Greek.
It was
so,
not
yeah, I mean, so we do have, this sense of like a continuous, well, not unchallenged, but a long heritage of Ukrainian identity. One thing, that's often brought up is the alliance between the Cossacks and Moscow. I mean, is that something either of you would like to speak to? Just sort of like the significance, the implications of that, and why it doesn't in any way undermine Ukrainian independence?
Oh, so now it's on. So one more point to the previous discussion. I'm really glad you guys have brought up the topic of Greece, because one more country that was situated on the territory is of crucial importance to Russia and to Moscovia and Russia, is the Byzantium Empire. And Russian imperialism never stops because they have their own name for the Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was called back then. In Russian nationalist circles, they call it Tsarograd, as it was called in Kiev and Russia. And they actually view it as a part of potential Russian territories that some days will come back home, as they want to call it. And the reason why I brought this topic is the coat of arms of Russian Empire and Russian Federation. They are not really different. It's the eagle with two heads, and this two-headed bird was actually, may I say, inspired by the Byzantium Empire's symbol. It was actually brought to Russia by Ivan III, the Tsar of Russia, in ish 1490s, and it was the moment they started the narrative of Russia and Moscow foremost being the Third Rome. And it's really important for Russian Empire to have some longevity. They actually hate the fact that Kiev is older than Moscow, and there is even a war between Russian spelling of the name of our capital and the Ukrainian one. You may have seen it in several news topics in maybe 2019, 2020, when Ukrainians started the movement Kyiv, not Kiev, trying to convince other languages, other nations to correct the spelling of this word. And Russians took it really personally because they think that Russian language is something that makes you Russian. If you speak Russian, of course you're Russian, even if you live in some former republic of Soviet Union. And that is the reason why even some countries that have nothing to do with the former Rus are now in a great danger of being attacked after Ukraine. I mean Russian, see Soviet Union as the perfect form of Russian existence because it was the biggest, and of course it's maybe the final form of the government they see and they actually use to protect. And Russia ends where their military capabilities end. And it has nothing to do with any identity, with any kind of maybe humanization of the conflict. Yeah, we have already stated that there was a Ukrainian republic in 1917 plus 1918. And after that, after it being conquered by, once again, Russians, Bolsheviks, there were two narratives born that are still being talked about. First one is Kharkiv, Ukrainian city, being the first capital of Ukraine. It's actually funny because it never was. It never was a capital of Ukrainian Republic because Ukrainian Republic was born in Kiev, and actually the first memorandum was signed in Kiev. And if we speak about the Bolshevik Republic, it's just the same thing as recognizing the occupation of Crimea or occupation of other Ukrainian territories. It legally, it means nothing. But we still can hear, even without any political pro-Russian context, that Kharkiv is the first Ukrainian capital, and it's the thing we are trying to maybe we're trying to make some context to the statement to people who are using it. And the second one is funny idea of Vladimir Putin that Lenin actually was the founder of Ukraine because he produced the politics of Ukrainization in 20-ish years of the 20th century. And it is funny because the reason for the politics of Ukrainization was to pacify the Ukrainians who wanted to live as an independent state and to make it, such kind of maybe gas bomb. So you see an illusion of a free state where you are allowed to speak your language, where you are allowed to have your own culture. You are just not a single state. Yeah, you have the capital of Moscow, but everything else is allowed, is permitted. But it's far from truth, and we all remember the terror that started not in 1937. It is usually viewed by the Western politics and Western view of the Soviet Union. The actual terror started actually in 1922, maybe 1923, The first repression started back then, and they never stopped. It was just the amount of people killed that difference.
Excellent. Alex, any more thoughts? Or, I mean, we have a whole host of questions we'd like to ask you, but we're also quite aware that your time is precious. So, if we could just sort of.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry, I like Eugene, I forget to put on my microphone. Actually, like you, Jeffrey, or errare humanum est. Gentlemen, if we still have time, can we talk more? Because we had some of those questions more, and I really enjoyed this, and I really hope that our audience will too. I just think that probably we gave a little bit too much of history. Well, in this case, I don't know other way around it. Um, um, Jeffrey, what is left on our list?
Thank you, Alex. So yeah, I mean, as contemporary creators, why don't we bring this back from history? We've established a really good base ground. We've kind of gotten into a lot of the nomenclature and ideology at play. But as both of you are creators and contemporary Ukrainian creators, could you just speak a bit about your feelings towards moving back to writing, towards creating content, towards perpetuating Ukrainian culture amidst the thick of war, and just what you feel your obligations, interests, and motivations are?
If I may start here, I felt like writing several times in the last months, like going back to it. But then the problem is I write historical fiction. I like exploring history, and what I adore most is finding some small kernels that resonate with our contemporary situation, that helps us understand the modernity better by understanding history and exploring how same processes, cultural, social, and so on, apply back then and nowadays, which is a huge problem now, because now all the Ukrainians see what I was trying to say for the last 5 years that I am into writing, because now it all feels like it doesn't make that much sense, because, well, the problems I was writing about, though never using Russia as an example, because I just never felt like it, I was using Austrian-Hungarian context, the one which is closer to me, as my region was a part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. But now, what can I even say? Everyone understands why empires do what they do. We are facing that same empire and the same problems I was exploring in 19th century, trying to explain some modern problems we are having via that imperial prism, imperial lens, is now just obvious for any Ukrainian, because we saw that empire coming on us 10 times worse than I ever dared to write, because every time I write something about your common atrocities, I try to limit myself and not to make it all, to transform it all into gore and war porn, because that's not what I want to do. But then, how can you do otherwise now? The novel I am working on, well, I was working before it all started. It takes place in 20s and 30s. It concerns a period of interbellum between First and Second World Wars, and then coming of Soviet Union and Nazi occupation. Lots of horrible stuff to describe there. Literally nothing new to say right now. Everything I was to put about that period, well, the worst period we came through so far, we now saw on photos and videos in real time, actually. In real time, from Ukrainian cities we've been to, shot by people we all know, and well, shot by our friends and so on. So it's kind of about changing my own perspective on what to write about, how to write about it. And actually, I'm currently working on a short story regarding the destruction of Russian Moskva cruiser, which was destroyed a few days ago. Just because Russian versions about how it happened were so hilarious, I felt obliged to write some sci-fi story about time loop where a soldier relives different versions of Russian propaganda about what has happened that night. So that's the only that really dark, and you can call it trash war satire, is the only thing I can bring myself to work on right now. And apart from that, it's nothing more. I really hope it's at least a bit better for Eugene, because he doesn't write historical fiction. He works in a different field, so I believe he will have something more to say here.
I'm just going to make things worse. I'm
I'm
working
working
with
with
horror.
horror.
There is no way I can go on using this genre to portray things I wanna bring to this world, because even the darkest creature I can imagine is way more humane than Russian soldiers that came to rape, to kill, to murder, to genocide my nation. So there is no way I can see myself getting back to the genre I'm actually in love with. I actually love horror stories, and maybe it will take some time. But as a creator, I'm actually grateful to Jeffrey for bringing up this word. As a creator, I would love to take a little bit more attention to the cinematic side of things, as at the end of the last year, I managed to film a movie. Well, it's not an actual movie, it's something like DIY project, a documentary about the stone tomb in Ukraine. It's not even an architectural state, it's the great monumentum made by nature, which was used by several nations, several, even we won't call it nations, it's, several tribes, several folks to portray their everyday life. And we have some strong possibility of some kind of proto writing being inscribed there. And it's situated, it's just happened so that it is situated near Melitopol, near my hometown. And I was actually going to return from my weekend, and it was the 24th of February, right? That very day. I was going to return from my weekend and come home to shoot the movie, the documentary about the cultural identity of Ukrainian south, of the south of Ukraine, about Kherson, about Melitopol, about lots of Greece settlements, about Tatar culture. It was going to be maybe a series of four-ish, five little movies, and I just, there is nothing I hope more for as a creator than to just return home and be able to shoot the way different movie about this territory, and to give a lot of voiceless people some kind of voice.
Thank you. Yes, I totally understand you, gentlemen. I mean, when you speak of impact that the present has on your creativity, Actually, funny thing, memory, even you saw today when we started, my memory failed me. That is because of stress. Uh, I would like if we can still go on a bit. Do you have a bit of time still? Can we? Yes, I'm trying to look at. I'm trying to listen to us on behalf of our audience, which are not rooted into this context, and we have managed to describe like at least a millennia of our common history with Moscovia that has become Russia with Peter the First, and Russians as ethnicity, I think, were first time appear in an order of Stalin. Is that true or not? In 1932, I heard it something like this. For fifth line in the passport, he introduced it. But my point is that I want to invite you to another little session here, in which we uh, show the consistency of it, right? We already did in a great deal. I mean, explaining what is the Russian world is and why they're pursuing it, and also with doing so, by doing so to explain how they like why they need the war and how we should understand them here, right? Uh, uh, and I will do it. I will just say my opinion, and then I will invite all of you gentlemen just to comment or argue, whatever. uh, you, you know, Ukrainian historians that I read, they because well, they claim that in territory of so-called Russia, which is Moscovia, there are no burials bearing human remains older than 2000 years. And this shows us why, for instance, Herodotus said that Protoslavs, they lived between Dnistro and Dnipro, and further east and north lived cannibals. And also that is a flat archaeological proof that metaphorically saying all Russia lags behind on a scale of time. They just exit from Stone Age a bit later than Europe and even Ukrainians. If we had Scythian and Sarmat kingdoms, if we had Kukutin and Tripilya culture, they were like people in those lands were eating each other. And I think by this is the reason why we see that all of empires, and they were plenty. Britain was an empire, France was an empire, Netherlands were an empire, like Portugal, all of them. They all dissolved before end of 20th century, in the middle of 20th century, like 60 something, right? And most of them even earlier, because economics of the world were changing and this form of state was no more of a benefit. But it never changed for that part of world. While other empires were dissolving, Russia grew eastwards, right? And because of this speed, slow speed, I think this is my idea. The whole Europe now is facing this problem, and we are just again becoming shield of it. And like you showed it in your speech here, gentlemen, multiple times. This is not the first time, and if our listeners or viewers didn't know it for some reason, just because probably they didn't love history as we do. But I just call this war, this is like my own feeling, how I feel it. I call this war Soviet European war. And there is another ridge to it. if we look from a legal perspective, because I see this, I see it also as a lawyer, right? So this line, this front line, this thin line between Europe and Ukraine as Europe and Russia, uh, this difference, main of which the whole bloodshed happens, is due to the fact that on one side of this line, on the Western side, on European, on Ukrainian side, we are essentially citizens, which is not only humans, but also political humans, ready to take responsibility for their state, doing this partial job of being a citizen every day, not only when we vote. And on the other side, there is nothing like that. They are not citizens. They are subjects, and it still goes on. And they love it, that there is a Tsar. They don't have to decide. They just have to serve properly, and they will get it. They will be rewarded. This is how I see it, and I don't see any other name. And I really think something like that will be in historical textbooks of future. This is, for me, this is Soviet-Ukrainian war. And I would love to hear you gentlemen reacting to this term. Thank you.
I believe I have two comments here. First, on Russian immense growth back then, back in the days of yore, as you call it. So Mongol invasion left a long-lasting trauma on then Russian society and on Muscovite society. For them, it was an existential threat that might have repeated itself. And while we today may tend to associate Russians and Mongols in many terms, sometimes understandable ones like a huge chunk of land being inhabited by people just invading for no reason from our perspective, but still, back then, back in 13th, 14th centuries, it was a trauma, deep historical trauma that made them, after the Mongol Empire collapsed, look for some way of survival, which was finding a natural border that will stand between them and possible invaders from the east. So they went eastwards to the Ural Mountains and decided, well, perhaps we might stop there, but then we have this large piece of land between Urals and the Caspian Sea, which we call Eurasian steppe. It's a flatland that, with no big rivers or mountains to stop the possible invasion. So they went farther. They passed Ural Mountains and expanded into Siberia. They expanded into Middle East as far as the Pacific Ocean. And that was the point where they couldn't move any farther. Well, there was Alaska, but they sold it to the United States. And then there was Europe, on the other hand. The second part of this, the second piece of this puzzle is the term Russian world, or Ruski Mir, as they call it in Russian, because we have a one-to-one counterpart in ancient history, which is called Pax Romana. That's the same idea of uniting different peoples in one huge empire and waging a constant war with the hands of these peoples. That's what Romans did, and that's what Russian, I'm not saying trying to do, is actively doing, because most people coming to Ukraine right now are not Slavic. They are not what typical American or even Western European would think of as Russians. On Reddit and on YouTube, under the posts of imprisoned Russians in Ukraine, I see tons of comments, people saying, well, they do not look like Russians. Well, sure, they do not. They are Buryats, they are Bashkirs, they are Tatars. They do not look like you'd expect from a Slavic person. This is a colonial war waged by colonized people, not by Russians. That's one important part. And then the second part of Soviet-European war and war of values, as we sometimes love to call it, I'm not sure if, well, of course, it's not universal. When we say all people of Russia, all people of Ukraine, we don't mean every single person, sure, because there are collaborators here in Ukraine. There are some people in Russia opposing the aggression, and I personally know some. But when you take a 44 or 140 million nation, and then you handpick few hundred of each of them, few hundred collaborators here, a few thousand maybe, actively opposing to war in Russia, that is not representative. That is the definition of cherry picking. So when we say the entire nation, we mean entire nation, but for that several hundred or several thousand people actually doing something about that. So the Soviet idea, what Alexander described, is actually a very accurate one. It's about not just about being a subject. It's about what that means personally to you. Because, well, freedom is a responsibility, and I believe that every person who believes that he or she is free will agree here that it demands a responsibility for your choice when you vote, for your actions when you are trying to be active in your local community, in your town, in your region, wherever. But then being a subject demands really specific and narrow mindset. The person is by no means does not consist of that single mindset and that's all, but well, this mindset is a must. It's about believing that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And if you behave as a good person, if you behave the way state demands you to behave, then nothing bad will come to you. And if the state for some reason decides to punish you, when two things are possible here: either, as we have a proverb from Soviet times, Comrade Stalin, there was a terrible mistake. That's one option you have if state punishes you for no reason. And the second option, and many people go for this option, surprisingly for me, you believe that you did something wrong and the state is still right and just to punish you. That's what happens when you live in a world of oppression, and when you are made to believe that the state is always right and the Tsar is always right. If something bad happens to you, then you are not good enough. And if you die in combat, well, that's not a bad thing. You die a hero defending a state. So, well, as Romans put it, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. The death for homeland is sweet and beautiful. And there is a difference when you go for war of defense, when you decide to do it, and when you go for war of, when you go to invade some other country, and you believe that if you die for this cause, and your cause is just, of course, to oppress and rape and murder and rob, well, then it's a good thing. You must believe that what you are doing is good. And to believe that rape and murder is good, you must believe that whatever state says you is good. You must just leave behind all the moral judgment you are capable of and just trust yourself into hands of Tsar or General Secretary or President, whatever they call, whatever you are called. If you there is one person that can dictate what is good and what is bad, and that is actually similar to Old Testament approach of magical thinking, that God is kind of a wish machine, and if you behave properly, that wish machine will grant you some good stuff. That's what the book of Job is opposing to. It is opposing this Old Testament mindset, which was commonplace back then. It opposes this kind of magical thinking, but, well, we see that many Russians are keeping it to these days, but instead of God, they are putting all their faith in their president, which is really Byzantine if you think of it, because Eastern Church was always about king or emperor or president being above the church, dictating the church what to do, while Western world, Catholic and then Protestant world, was about a king or the emperor being below the will of God. This kind of dynamics exists. It pains me to say, to oversimplify it this way, but that's what I see. I cannot say that it doesn't exist because the consequences are here and we are facing it right now.
May I give a small? I want to add here as a lawyer again, because it reminded it of my days in university when we were studying theory of state, I believe it's translated, and philosophy. And I was taught that difference between, like I will simplify it here very much for the sake of listener. The difference between like Europe, Ukraine, and Russia is, or Asia, are two different models of thinking. In Western world, there is such a value as human life and human rights, an individual, right? And whereas in Asia, your life is worth nothing. You are worthless until you are making part of a big thing. And there must be a vertical of power, and there must be one Tsar to rule it. And if we talk that much of history, we also need to mention that Ukraine today, this modern national state, because this is also a new concept, it is heir of Rus. And according to Herodotus and many other accounts, Slavs had a sort of democracy. They were electing. They were commonly decided, at least before Kagans arrived, princes, right? Who will rule. While Moscovia, aka Russia, is heir of Golden Horde. I mean, in mindset terms, right? In philosophical terms, they inherited the way of organization of society, vertical one, right? There is a Tsar, and that is why Putin today is not president; he is a Tsar, essentially. So for us and for Westerners, national state is a common effort, something in which we participate for the sake of common benefit, and this is what is our state, right? Our state is a common undertaking, and for like that Asia, medieval Asia, Tsar is state. And here I also remembered one funny thing that happened to me in the library somewhere in early 2000s, Central Scientific Library of Kiev. I ran into an almanac, how you call it, almanac, I think, in English, right? Like a magazine, a regular thick magazine on constitutional law, Moscow one, with name Vlast, which is the power. And that was editorial, right? And I still remember the first passage of there, I think by heart, and I will try to translate it now. It read, human rights are toxic Western ideology meant to destroy our state. So this Asian imperial tradition is really strong, and this is the only actually thing, the ideological glue, which keeps so-called Russia together. Yes, I really want to hear Eugene also.
Oh, and also just sort of on that, if I could just add one point that sort of knits everything together, is that we have this idea of Slavic exceptionalism that is sort of central to Russian ideology. It gets into what you're talking about with who these soldiers are, with what they're stealing, with what they're doing. They're coming from the most corrupt, decrepit, impoverished places in, the most distant parts of Russia, and they come to Ukraine and they see success despite everything, despite all of Russia's efforts to produce a failed state through war, through embargo, through terrorism. They failed. Ukraine is still enjoying some degree of Western prosperity that is just overtly superior to the everyday way of life experienced by these soldiers who are coming and raping and pillaging and murdering. Ukraine is the antidote to this idea that Russia has this Slavic character that is outside of all of this domain of Western notions of humanity, of equanimity, and like Alex was talking about, just sort of a basic right of an individual. And Ukraine's mere existence just makes that ideology impossible because these are Slavs. They are living well. They are living in the modern world, and we are suffering. So, I mean, I
That
think
is
that's
what
really, yeah.
that is what Peskov said. We don't want anti-Russia next to us. Yes, they don't have their villages gasified. They are stealing here toilet seats. We
Yeah.
have numerous accounts of Ukrainians that they said we saw authentic natural surprise on their faces when they for the first time saw toilet inside of a house, or as they were talking about paved roads of our villages.
I think
Eugene,
particularly in Slavutich, well, I mean, that was just a really good example because obviously Slavutich was sort of this model, centrally planned city, very organized, very clean, and these soldiers are crossing the border and stealing potatoes. But please, yeah, Evgen, please chime in.
Yeah, gentlemen, unfortunately, my time is a little bit off because we have a really tough situation on the southern front, and my logistical help is needed. But I just can't help but add something to your story about stealing actual toilets, because this is what happened in Vasilievka. Vasilievka is a little town in the Zaporizhia region, and it had actually past tense. It had a museum where one of the exponents was a ceramic toilet from 19th century. Russian soldiers, when they saw it, they just broke the uh, some kind of protection it had, and they have stolen this ceramic toilet. We don't know its whereabouts right now, but it is the story I know from the first person, from actually the person who guarded this museum. And yes, unfortunately, I wish I could have stayed a little bit longer and talked to you a little bit longer. Thank you for your time. And I hope I will be able to listen to the end of your conversation in some kind of recording.
this will be iRadio, and we of course will share with you our links. Thank you very much, Eugene Lear,
Thank you so
creator
much for
from
joining
Southern.
us, and we will
Eugene.
have a Spotify link in, I don't know, about an hour after we conclude. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, and I hope we can speak again as well, as this has been
Yeah.
Yeah,
really a
Thank you for
fantastic
having me.
discussion.
Yeah.
A
Thank
pleasure.
you for having me.
thank you.
If I may add one small
Please
tidbit
do.
to this whole toilet thing, because we have western part of Ukraine was occupied by Russians in 1939. So my grandfather, my great grandfather especially, they remembered it all. They told me we have many anecdotes of Soviet soldiers being like savages seeing toilets for the first time, and using a night their wives using like pajamas as a commonplace clothing and so on. And every time I heard these anecdotes, and there are hundreds of them, I thought, well, that must be an over exaggeration that just should not and cannot be true. And now I hear literally the same stories as the first-hand accounts of my friends who stayed for some time or the entire time of Russian occupation of northern regions of Ukraine. And you know what? I still refuse to believe that. Like, my mind is actively uh, refusing to accept this information as true because I just don't dare to recognize this as anything based on reality. While I obviously understand that this is true because hundreds and hundreds of people telling the stories cannot be conspired to tell lies, but still, that is something I find incredibly tough to believe because it is so alien to anything and everything that I am as a person.
Alien, alien. Yes, I love the way you pick words. Um, mm, it is a well, Jeffrey. If you have microphone,
Yeah, sure. Honestly, I think we're bringing everything together in a really nice way, especially with this notion of the Soviet European War, just with the ideology on the ground. Um, Sort of as we bring things to a conclusion, I know none of us really have much time to think about the Russian people, but one thing Alex and I have talked about a bit is that, until Russia is ready to have their own Maidan moment, which is such an impossibility to even conceive of right now, that they don't have any hope of escaping empire and escaping the conditions of empire that define their nation. Is that something you could speak to at all?
I can, well, maybe be a bit even more pessimistic here if that's possible. I don't believe that Russians may have a kind of Maidan movement that will change their state for the better, as the kind of state they live in is just not suited for any democratic transformation. Eh, if you can conceive any kind of democratic movement in Russian state, you must understand that there will be regional movements, ethnocentric movements, because that's what follows every single time. Russia as the whole cannot be democratic and survive. Being totalitarian state, being an empire, and being a colonial empire is its essence as a political entity. So I believe that while they may have a kind of grassroots revolution that will lead to, let's say, regime change, let's say impossible happens and Putin is out and Navalny, well, because why not, Navalny is in power, nothing will change, literally nothing, because if anything I will feel even more threatened back then, because Navalny, I believe, is sincerely interested in Russia becoming a powerhouse, not a powerhouse on paper like it is now, not a look-alike powerhouse that threatens everyone to feel the slightest bit secure. But if they have an authoritarian leader who is interested in eliminating corruption and making Russia really strong, we will all be in much more danger than we are now. If Russia has a truly democratic leader, it will cease to exist. I am convinced of that, because I believe sooner than later regions will realize that they are literally feeding the state apparatus, that only shreds and pieces of what regions rich in oil and gas and precious metals produce is actually staying there. Decentralized Ukraine is, well, Ukraine we live in now, because Ukraine is more or less an ethnic state, the kind of state you think of when you think of a European country. Most European countries are more or less ethnic based. We have tens of ethnicities living in Ukraine, And well, guaranteeing their rights is pivotal, sure, but we have no single region except for Crimea, which is, and I believe should be, a Tatar Krimlar, Crimean Tatar region, because well, they are indigenous people of that region. You have no single region with other someone else apart from Ukrainians being a majority or even 50-50 there. Russia is a totally different thing. Why the hell would Buryats or uh, same Chechens believe that they should be a part of this greater whole, if not for that imperialistic idea of serving the state to be granted something from the state? So yeah, I believe that the only way Russia can become democratic is that Russia can become at least several states, and in best case, at least several dozens more ethnic states that will decide for themselves what is good and what is bad for them, and not for Moscow.
Thank you very much. And I will first comment here as a lawyer and then punish you for word Navalny with my reaction on it. Well, you see, in theory of state, empire is anachronic thing, right? It existed when there was after Neolithic revolution, when there was agriculture as main sort of economics, and land was the main resource. And that is why empires came. They needed to snatch a big a piece of land, ensuring richer crops and so on and so forth. This game went on a little bit when industrial economics came, because oil and ores are also nice. So empires endured a bit more. But then further, as we approach the informational economy in which we live now, this bulky state form became retarded and outdated. And it's very expensive to sustain. And yes, it threatens with collapse. So all of other states became like I mean Britain, France, again, all of those who were empires, they became smaller, and they control their former colonies rather economically than, or as today it happens with memes or with internet, but not with AK-47. And that is why human rights matter there and doesn't matter in Russia. They are really, that guy from that magazine, The Power, was right. Human rights are deteriorating this huge medieval dinosaur. It suffocates without monopoly in information. And recently, I don't know, Ostap, if you saw, oh, what is her name? Margarita Simonyan, right? This propagandist from Russian TV. I mean, top propagandist, right? She is editor to Russian Today, I believe, right? She explicitly said it. We are too big not to have a censorship, not to control information, right? So they are basically anchoring their state as a project to the past, not to die, not to turn in those dozens of small countries that you just mentioned. But the thing is that history has its logic, and there is a straight corridor all of civilization already passed. And this roaring mob in behind us with grads and cannons and tanks, it is doomed to follow it. So now to Navalny. Guys, you think of me whatever. I also address to our audience, but I am ready to bet here that Navalny is next Tsar. And the thing that he is in Labed there, he's just, this is a long game. When he exits, he must have a history of suffering, a history of oppression and everything, and to become more attractive for subjects. But all of us who live here next to this thing. We remember Navalny saying racist things, racist about Georgians, about Caucasus people. We remember in 2008 him demanding carpet bombings of Georgia. And surprisingly, and this is by the way, well, surprisingly in brackets, right? I don't know if you heard it, but just these days, maybe a week ago, from that prison where he, as Solzhenitsyn, even writes a Telegram blog, right? I say, right? Incredible. Isn't he FSB? Of course he is. So he made the call to the free world not to supply Ukraine with arms, disarmament, right? Demilitarization. He said, don't give arms. Right? Which implies they're just Russians which are misled, as you put it, Ostap, very well put. And then another thing, if you, well, I will post it on my Instagram tomorrow, today. While Navalny is imprisoned, his deputy is free. And he also has a blog on Instagram. And recently, just like yesterday, after, well, when we had these missiles, day before yesterday, there were missiles in Lviv, right? Which is a regional center in western part of Ukraine. He commented on that. There was a picture of this car service which was devastated by Caliber missiles. And he says something like this. You just shoot $7.5 million missile to destroy a car service. Are you kidding? What kind of politics is that? Of course, he was punched and kicked in the comments because he was speaking not of human lives, not of losses, not of how unfair, how unnecessary is this. Sorry, not atrocities, but well, you see me, right? This war, let's say like this, right? He's speaking of price, of like proper investing, right? If you want to hit 6.5 million, hit something better, right? So again, Ostap, I believe that Navalny is next Tsar, at least in mind of FSB. I really hope that your prophecy or your idea that by the way, I share totally, but I love the way you put it. I was thinking of 6 or 7 democratic young republics, and you put it dozens in plural. I love it. Please comment.
Well, it's not about the number for me. In fact, it's about literally self-determination. If several ethnic groups decide they are nice and well in one single republic, then why not? Literally, why not? But the problem is that yes, Russia as it exists today, of course, is the existential threat for Ukrainians, and that is not uncalled for because we saw what they are capable of. And I believe that Russia will remain such an existential threat in the foreseeable future. But I also believe that it cannot not be the existential threat for Ukrainians, as its very nature requires it to expand. And the only way this kind of this idea can be brought down is by bringing down the Russia itself. Problem is they never had any spare ideology. Let's put it that way. The only way of thinking Russia knows is to require Ukraine and Belarus to be and become eventually a part of it. They have no other option than to go for it. And while Western analysts called this war unnecessary and crazy, and they believed that everyone I read and listened to said that.
Sorry to interrupt you. These are legal terms. When they say it, they use international law concepts. You see, they're already pushing it towards Hague. Go on.
Yeah, but I mean that everyone I read and listened and watched pointed that Putin has more to lose than to gain in this war, no matter what happens. Well, I believe that in his mind and in the mindset of a typical Russian imperialist, everything is to gain or everything is to lose here. Literally, the security of your state ideology is at stake, and that's why when Ukraine didn't fall in 3 days, so many propagandists, including Simonian and including Solovyov, started saying that, well, the existence of Ukraine is a threat to Russia. And I believe that they were sincere in this one point because they believe it, and it is so because they have no other option than to go for it. Well, and I believe that will be almost all the time I had to spare by now, like 3 more minutes to conclude because it's past 9 o'clock. It's really, I didn't expect it to
Yeah,
be
we
so.
were about to wrap up actually.
Honestly, this is just, yeah, I wasn't expecting this to last this long, but frankly, we've just had so much valuable insight from you and Evgen that, I'm really happy it has. So sort of on that last point, and just to wrap things up, a lot of people are asking why now? Yes, if Putin has more to lose than he has to gain, I mean, if on paper a land war in Ukraine can achieve nothing unless they could actually manage to do something in 48 hours. And by the way, let's not forget that about a week into the war, there were reports that there were already sort of puppet dictators ready to move into Kiev, waiting in Belarus. But if you could just sort of remark on why now, and just any further comments you'd like to make generally to a Western audience, just as we wrap up, please go ahead.
Uh, Globally, I cannot comment on that because I have no idea of particularities, some wheels clicking in Putin's head. But if I am to point one thing of why now, I can point at why 24th of February. Because first it was 16th, as Boris Johnson said, then it was 22nd, and all that informational fuzz around 22nd, and that the idea was to attack, well, because Putin loves symbolism and his generals and his advisors love symbolism, but that's not about that. 24th of February is a counterpart to Ukrainian Independence Day, which is 24th of August. It is exactly 6 months apart. And I believe that this kind of symbolism played really well for a guy that Putin is and showed to be all these decades.
Perfect. And may I do the wrap up? It will take 60 seconds, gentlemen, really. So just summarizing what we talked here in 2 hours, and I don't think it could have been shorter because I enjoyed every second of it. Thank you very much, Ostap and Evgen, for sharing your time with us, because we spoke of historical origins, of differences, of historical appropriations, and even a bit of historical actions, of philosophical nature of West and empires of Asia. And I really believe that for thinking mind, this is kind of a good food, good background, good, I don't know, base to understand why Russia wages this war, why they say that it's all or nothing. Because their anchor to the past almost doesn't work. A big and successful and Slavic and Orthodox and whatever project next to them that they call anti-Russia is winning on all fronts. Actually, Ukraine already won philosophically, morally, historically, all of that, conceptually. And the last thing is being done now by Ukrainian military. They are doing the work in field. So God bless Ukrainian military. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for these 2 hours of brilliant insights. And I mean, I love your framing, guys. I always love. And honestly, it took us so long just because of the pleasure I get from talking to you. And I also hope that this pleasure will be shared. And I also really hope that one day we'll talk again.
Fantastic.
Thank you,
And
Jeffrey,
thank you
for
both
having
for
us here. It was a great conversation. It was such a nice experience, and 2 hours of my life spent with great pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you. And Evgen, hopefully you're listening to this later. So much for joining us. This has really been fantastic. And there just simply isn't an abundance of Ukrainian voices explaining this with sufficient detail or context to Western audiences. So I think, this was extremely pleasurable for me, enjoyable and educating, but I think this could mean a lot also. So again, thank you for joining us here on Irradio.
Yes,
I'm
it's
Jeff.
And me, Alex PTSD. We had 2 Ukrainian contemporary writers, Ostap Ukrainets and Eugene Lear. We really hope this talk will have its impact. Thank you very much for following us. Thank you very much for listening. Please share, click, share, subscribe. You know the game.
And if you want to support the channel, it is patreon.com/PTSD86, or give Alex a follow on Instagram, PTSD86. And thank you all for
let's
watching.
not forget, yes, and let's not forget to advertise one of my favorite YouTube channels, which I hope has already English captions. Do you have English captions already, Ostap? Guerrilla Humanities.
For some of our videos, yes, we have. So if you take a look, you should find some.
Good. Thank you very much. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава, слава нація. And
Смерть.
Смерть ворогам.
смерть ворогам.
Дякую.
And are we cool?